Savannah Rose had not come to the neighborhood to make a statement, and she certainly had not moved into the quiet cul-de-sac to become a subject of gossip. After nearly a decade of working in sterile laboratories, where fluorescent lights hummed endlessly and every conversation was governed by non-disclosure agreements, she longed for a slower rhythm. The small house she bought was far from glamorous. Its shingles curled like brittle paper, and the paint on the porch rails flaked whenever she brushed her hand across them. But to her it represented a reclamation of time. She wanted mornings when the only sound was the wind threading through oak branches, afternoons spent tending to soil and seedlings, and evenings where she could read without hearing the echo of corporate debates about patents and profit margins. A quiet, anonymous existence was not only preferable, but necessary, for she was still carrying the fatigue of being dismissed, not for lack of talent, but for asking too many questions about the ethical boundaries of her former employer. Her new neighbors did not know her history, but they seemed curious from the beginning. At first, she believed it was harmless suburban curiosity, the kind that makes people linger a few seconds longer at the mailbox or wave with a slightly exaggerated cheer when they pass on their evening walks. But she noticed subtle differences. Conversations would stop as she approached, and people who introduced themselves did so with an edge of caution, as if her solitary presence was already a violation of unspoken norms. She was polite, never effusive, and she rarely lingered at neighborhood barbecues, but she answered questions about plants with accuracy that bordered on clinical detail. When a young couple down the street showed her a patch of suspicious mushrooms, she identified them as harmless ink caps but added a warning that consuming them with alcohol could cause illness. The couple smiled awkwardly, thanked her, and avoided her afterward, perhaps unsettled by the precision of her answer. Savannah tried not to mind. She had not moved here to build a social empire. She wanted her garden, her books, and the piece of a schedule that belonged only to her. On the community forum, she registered under her full name and occasionally posted guides on composting or invasive weeds, never realizing that some read her thoroughness as strange rather than generous. She walked the narrow woodland path behind her property each morning, notebook in hand, cataloging bird songs and insect activity with the same patience she had once given to microbial colonies. It was in those moments that she felt most herself, restored and steady, convinced that whatever shadows had followed her from the laboratory years would dissolve into the soil of this new home. That illusion cracked in the first month of summer. She had risen before dawn, coffee cooling in a ceramic mug as she checked the mulch beds for signs of slugs. The sky was a pale gray canvas, still waiting for color, and the silence was deep enough that the rustle behind the compost bin jolted her spine. She expected a raccoon, perhaps a fox, but what emerged was neither timid nor familiar. It was a cat, but larger, with legs too long, ears pointed and tufted like brushes dipped in soot, its coat patterned with golden flecks that shimmered faintly even in the low light. It looked at her directly, without fear, eyes like polished amber holding something ancient and unsettling. Instead of skulking away, it padded closer, sniffed at the rim of the compost pile, and pulled a half-eaten pear from the heap as if it had done so 100 times. For long seconds she could not move. Her mind supplied the name almost unwillingly. Serval. She had read about them, seen photographs from African reserves, but never expected to face one a few feet from her garden gloves. Yet here it was, thin but strong, calmly chewing fruit pulp like a domesticated pet. Savannah whispered without thinking, "What are you doing here?" The serval flicked an ear, swallowed, and with a casual grace leapt back over the fence, vanishing into the brush. She stood alone in the rising light, her pulse loud in her ears, certain that what she had seen was real, though her rational mind struggled to accept it. Exotic animals did not belong in suburban backyards, and yet one had looked her straight in the eye before disappearing into the woods that the HOA insisted were perfectly safe. For the first time since moving in, Savannah felt the boundary between her solitude and the world beyond begin to blur, and with that came a quiet dread that her life in this neighborhood would not remain simple for long. The first letter came folded neatly in a cream-colored envelope with the HOA logo embossed in metallic green, a detail so ostentatious that Savannah almost laughed when she pulled it from the mailbox. At first, she assumed it would be another reminder about lawn care schedules or some invitation to a neighborhood cookout, both of which she usually ignored without consequence. But when she opened the envelope and began to read, her face tightened, and by the time she finished, her hand was trembling with a mix of disbelief and restrained anger. The letter accused her of violating community safety standards by attracting and harboring dangerous wildlife on her property. It went on to describe multiple complaints made by concerned residents who had allegedly seen exotic animals, including a large wild cat, roaming near her yard. According to the HOA board, she was responsible for creating hazardous conditions, and unless she corrected the issue, she would be fined and possibly subjected to further disciplinary measures, including forced inspections. The tone was polished but unmistakably hostile, each line crafted to sound like the voice of authority rather than a mere collection of neighbors on a committee. Savannah read it again, slower, searching for any sign that it was a mistake or perhaps even a joke, but there was no humor in the formal language, no trace of goodwill. She pictured the serval she had seen at dawn, the golden flecks in its fur, the calm way it had claimed fruit from her compost, and she understood instantly that this was no random accusation. Someone else had seen the animal, or at least someone wanted to believe they had, and now she was to be punished for it. Her first instinct was rational. Exotic animals did not materialize in suburban woodlands by chance, so she would contact local authorities, report the sighting, and have the matter documented. But as she read the letter a third time, she noticed the phrasing, how it implied not simply that the animal was present, but that she had somehow caused or encouraged its presence. The accusation was not passive. It was pointed directly at her as though she had deliberately invited danger into the neighborhood. She placed the letter flat on the kitchen table and stared at it, the sunlight slanting across the paper in such a way that the embossed seal gleamed like a medal pinned to a soldier's chest. Her mind drifted to her years in the lab, when documents were often manipulated to conceal truths, when phrasing was carefully chosen to assign blame without ever saying so directly. She knew the language of misdirection, and here it was, dressed up in suburban authority. The following day she attended her first official HOA meeting, something she had previously avoided out of disinterest. It was held in the community center, a low brick building that smelled faintly of disinfectant and artificial citrus. Folding chairs were arranged in rows, and on a raised platform at the front sat the board members, their expressions already tightened with suspicion, as if her presence were an intrusion rather than a right. At the center was Joan Barnett, the HOA president, a woman in her late 50s with hair sprayed into an immovable auburn crown and a smile that looked carved rather than genuine. Joan tapped her pen against a clipboard as Savannah took her seat, her eyes following her like a predator sizing up prey. The meeting unfolded with tedious routine at first, budget reports, landscaping contracts, and discussions about repainting the sign at the neighborhood entrance. But then Joan cleared her throat and shifted the agenda. "We've had repeated complaints," she announced, her voice smooth, regarding dangerous wildlife activity originating near the property of Minns. Savannah Rose's heads turned, some with sympathy, others with curiosity, but several with barely concealed disdain. Joan continued, "There have been sightings of large predatory animals, including what may have been a serval or similar exotic species. Photographs have been provided." She held up a printout of a blurry image showing the outline of the animal at Savannah's fence. Gasps moved through the room, as if she had been caught harboring a tiger in her basement. Savannah stood, her voice steady but sharpened by controlled outrage. "That animal is not mine. I've seen it once, early in the morning. It appeared out of nowhere and left just as quickly. I have no knowledge of where it came from, and I certainly have not encouraged its presence." She searched the crowd, hoping to find reason in someone's face, but most looked away, unwilling to confront Joan's authority. Joan leaned forward, smile still fixed, but eyes glinting. "With respect, Ms. Rose, our community has standards, and when unusual conditions appear consistently on one property, it is reasonable to hold the homeowner accountable. Wild animals do not simply appear unless something draws them." The insinuation struck her harder than the words themselves. Something draws them. The implication was obvious, that her compost, her garden, her supposed eccentricities were somehow to blame. It was the oldest trick in the book: pathologize the outsider, make them responsible for anomalies, and then punish them for disturbing the fragile harmony of the group. Savannah wanted to shout, to demand logic, to ask if anyone truly believed she had imported a serval into her yard for personal amusement. Instead, she gathered her composure, knowing that outrage would only play into Joan's hands. She left the meeting under the gaze of murmuring neighbors and returned home with her chest tight, but when she reached her back fence, she stopped cold. In the exact spot where the serval had pawed at the soil days earlier, the earth was disturbed again. She knelt and brushed away loose dirt, her fingers striking something smooth. It was a fragment of transparent plastic, rectangular, with a thin digital strip running through it. She turned it in her hand, recognizing the form of a tracking tag, though the design was unlike any she had seen in her professional work. It had no manufacturer's name, only a string of coded numbers that refused to scan when she ran it beneath her phone's camera. Whatever it was, it did not belong in the soil of her garden. She stood slowly, the tag trembling in her palm, realization dawning that the appearance of the animal was not random at all. Someone had released it here, and now they were using the HOA to frame her as the culprit. For the first time since she moved in, Savannah felt her carefully built solitude fracture into something fragile and precarious, and though the neighborhood around her looked unchanged, every window and every clipped hedge now carried the weight of suspicion. By the end of that week, Savannah's quiet home had begun to feel less like a refuge and more like the center of a spectacle, as though unseen hands were rearranging the boundaries of her life to make her appear guilty. Neighbors who once greeted her with polite, if cautious, smiles now crossed the street when she appeared, whispering as though they had already reached a collective verdict. On Wednesday morning, she found another notice from the HOA taped not just to her mailbox but to her front door. An unnecessary display meant less as communication than as humiliation, and this new document stated that multiple exotic species had now been reported in proximity to her property. It was no longer just a serval. There were claims of a brightly colored parrot flying from her roofline, of a hoofed animal grazing near her fence, and of unusual noises at night described as screams or yelps of dangerous origin. The accusations were presented as fact, and she was ordered to schedule a compliance inspection within 10 days or risk immediate fines. At first, she thought it was another baseless exaggeration until she began to notice the changes herself. One evening, while pruning the overgrowth near her shed, she heard a series of sharp whistles above her head. She looked up to find a scarlet macaw perched on a power line, its feathers so vividly red they seemed unreal in the fading light, and when she took a hesitant step toward it, the bird launched itself skyward with a slow thunder of wings. Another morning, footprints appeared across the damp earth near her compost bin, small cloven shapes that belonged neither to deer nor goat, and when she followed them, they ended at the very edge of her fence, as though whatever had left them had been deliberately released there and then retrieved. The pattern was undeniable. Someone was introducing these animals into her environment in a way designed to make them appear attracted to her home, and the HOA was ready with paperwork each time, as if waiting to pounce the moment the creatures manifested. Determined not to be cornered by suggestion and rumor, Savannah purchased a set of discreet cameras and installed them along the back perimeter of her property, concealed within the branches of young maples where their small lenses could watch, without being noticed. She also placed a pair near the compost heap and one overlooking her back gate, reasoning that if these animals were being released deliberately, then someone would eventually betray themselves through carelessness. For several days, nothing occurred except the ordinary movements of raccoons and squirrels, yet on the fourth night she woke to an unfamiliar scratching sound outside her bedroom window. She stepped quietly onto the porch with a flashlight and caught the quick flash of a golden fur vanishing into the underbrush. In the morning, when she reviewed the footage from the garden camera, her breath caught. The serval was there again, prowling with a slow elegance, but what froze her blood was not the animal itself, but the glint of a small metallic tube half buried in the soil where it had dug. The serval nosed at the tube before losing interest and leaping the fence. When Savannah unearthed the object later, she discovered it was no ordinary piece of trash. It was a cylindrical container no longer than her hand, with tiny ventilation holes and a sliding latch, and inside, curled into drugged stillness, was a black-footed ferret. Its flank rose and fell weakly, its fur matted around a puncture wound where a syringe had been used. In the corner of the container lay the syringe itself, capped but unmistakable, with residue clinging to the inside. There was no plausible way such an item could have arrived naturally on her property. Someone had placed it there, and not just placed it, but buried it shallowly as if hoping the animal would rouse and emerge at the right moment, creating the perfect illusion of exotic wildlife drawn to her yard. Her hands shook as she carried the ferret inside, laying it on an old towel beneath a heat lamp she used for seedlings. She gave it water carefully, whispering as though the sound might coax it back from stupor, and while she nursed the fragile creature she felt a cold fury bloom inside her chest. This was not mere harassment. It was orchestration, an elaborate attempt to frame her as the source of a threat to the neighborhood. Yet how could she explain this to authorities when the HOA held the narrative so tightly? To them, every sighting would be further proof of her negligence, and if she brought forward the container, they might twist it as evidence of her own concealment. The following evening, a truck bearing the insignia of an animal control agency arrived unannounced at her curb. Two uniformed officers, carrying nets and tranquilizer rifles, marched onto her property without so much as a knock at the door, waving a copy of the HOA complaint as their warrant for entry. Savannah tried to protest, pointing out that her property was private and that she had filed no request for assistance, but they brushed her aside with curt professionalism. Within minutes they were scouring her yard, searching under the porch, peering into her shed, examining her compost pile. They found nothing but ordinary garden tools, yet one officer emerged from the shed holding up a scrap of cloth with a strange emblem printed on it, a hexagonal shape that meant nothing to her. The officer shrugged and said it must have been part of old equipment, but the way his partner's eyes flicked toward the HOA representatives waiting across the street made Savannah certain that the discovery was staged. That night, exhausted but too restless to sleep, she walked the perimeter of her fence again, flashlight sweeping across the earth, and noticed the same patch of soil disturbed where the serval had dug. She crouched low and brushed aside the dirt, expecting another container. Instead, she found a tag made of synthetic fiber, the kind used for equipment identification. Stamped into its surface was a code, and beneath it, in smaller lettering, the letters HOA Property. Her chest tightened with dread. The implication was clear. The very animals being discovered near her home were not merely wild strays, but somehow connected directly to the organization accusing her. The cameras had captured no clear evidence yet, only the fleeting presence of the animals themselves. But Savannah knew the trap was tightening. The HOA would escalate until they had enough to justify their inspections, their fines, and perhaps even legal action. Her home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage set for someone else's drama, and she realized she would need more than quiet vigilance to withstand what was coming. She would need to step into the conflict openly, to expose the scheme before it consumed her completely. The discovery of the marked tag should have been enough to convince Savannah that something calculated and deeply corrupt was taking place, yet in the days that followed the neighborhood seemed to move forward as though nothing unusual had occurred. Children still cycled past her house. Sprinklers still rotated across manicured lawns. Neighbors still trimmed hedges with the obsessive precision demanded by the HOA. But beneath that surface calm, she sensed a shift in atmosphere, as though every smile masked suspicion and every glance held judgment. She carried the tag in her pocket like a talisman, unsure whether to guard it as evidence or display it as the accusation, and her indecision gnawed at her as more animals appeared. One morning, a capybara wandered clumsily near her porch steps, grazing on grass with the dull calm of captivity rather than the wary instinct of a wild creature, and by evening another letter from the HOA had arrived demanding immediate remediation, for what they now termed a pattern of exotic infestations. Savannah knew silence would no longer protect her, and so she turned outward. Her first instinct was to consult a professional who could confirm what she already suspected, that these animals bore signs of captivity rather than wild origin. She contacted a regional wildlife rehabilitator doctor, Elaine Mercer, a woman with decades of fieldwork and a reputation for speaking bluntly. When Elaine visited, she knelt beside the soil where the capybara tracks were still visible, studying them with narrowed eyes before remarking that no such animal could have arrived naturally in this climate. She examined photographs Savannah had taken of the serval and noted the clipped appearance of its whiskers, something typically done when animals are handled in captivity. Finally, she asked to see the cylindrical container Savannah had unearthed with the sedated ferret, and when she turned it over in her hands, she muttered that it was a specialized release capsule used in controlled environments, not something one would find outside of a research facility. The confirmation filled Savannah with equal parts relief and dread, for while she was no longer alone in her suspicion, she was also staring at the outline of a conspiracy larger than she had imagined. Encouraged by Elaine's support, she contacted a lawyer, not out of faith in the courts, but to prepare for the inevitable escalation. Michael Harlan was younger than she expected, with a patient demeanor that concealed a sharp mind, and he listened carefully as she laid out each incident, each letter, each photograph. When she produced the tag-stamped HOA property, his expression hardened. He explained that while homeowner associations wielded broad authority in civil matters, they were not above the law, and if they were indeed involved in releasing animals, it would constitute criminal negligence and potentially fraud. Still, he warned her, evidence would be critical, for the HOA board would deny everything, and without irrefutable proof she would remain an easy scapegoat. Savannah nodded, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the faint stirrings of resolve, for if she could gather enough to expose them, she might not only defend her home, but unravel whatever scheme lay beneath. She returned to her cameras with renewed purpose, repositioning them to cover not only her own yard but also the wooded path leading into the neighborhood. Nights became a vigil, her sleep broken by the constant review of footage, each rustle of leaves or flicker of movement catalogued in growing files. For several nights she captured nothing more than shadows, until one dawn the lens recorded a shape more human than animal. A van, unmarked but familiar in its color and build, crept along the service road behind her fence. Its rear doors opened and two figures stepped out carrying a crate between them. They lifted the latch and shook the crate until an animal, a small antelope, its legs trembling, stumbled into the grass. Then, with swift indifference, they returned to the van and drove off. Savannah replayed the footage again and again, heart hammering, until she realized why the van felt familiar. Its shape and paint matched the utility vehicles often used by the HOA maintenance crews. When she presented the footage to Michael, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. The grainy video was enough to suggest foul play, but not enough to hold in court, as the faces of the individuals were obscured by hoods. He urged her to gather more, to remain vigilant, but he also encouraged her to prepare emotionally. For once she revealed this to the board or to outside authorities, the retaliation would be swift. Savannah returned home with a gnawing unease, But that night her vigilance was rewarded. On the community's digital forum, usually cluttered with trivial debates about lawn heights and recycling schedules, she noticed a thread titled, "Wildlife Crisis, Blame Where It Belongs." The posts within accused her by name, claiming that she had been seen feeding strange animals and building habitats to attract them. Attached to one post was a blurred photograph of her carrying the sedated ferret into her home, framed to suggest she was concealing it. Savannah realized instantly that someone had been watching her, turning her own desperate act of compassion into further evidence against her. It was then she made a decision. Rather than wait passively for the HOA to tighten its grip, she would take the risk of confronting them on their own stage. At the next scheduled board meeting, she arrived early, clutching the tag, the container, and a flash drive of her footage. The room filled quickly, neighbors buzzing with curiosity, their expressions sharpened by weeks of rumor. Joan Barnett presided once again, smiling as though certain of victory, and when the topic of wildlife was raised, she turned directly to Savannah. "Miss Rose, perhaps you would like to explain why exotic species continue to appear in your yard." Her tone was sweet, her posture regal, but Savannah felt the undercurrent of threat. She rose, her voice steadier than she expected, and recounted everything. The serval, the macaw, the capybara, the capsule, the tag, the video of the van. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Joan did not flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her smile sharpening, and said, "With respect, you provide only stories. Where is your proof that this board is involved?" Savannah placed the tag on the table where the board sat, the letters HOA Property gleaming under fluorescent light. For the first time, Joan's mask cracked, her hand twitching as though tempted to snatch it away. Murmurs filled the room, neighbors shifting uneasily, and Savannah pressed on, declaring that she had expert testimony, legal counsel, and video evidence. Joan attempted to regain composure, dismissing the items as fabrications or misunderstandings. But the board's unity wavered, one member clearing his throat nervously while another avoided eye contact. Savannah knew she had reached a turning point. She had not won, but she had forced the first fracture in their armor, and once a crack appears, pressure can only widen it. That night, as she walked home under the amber glow of streetlights, Savannah understood that the battle was no longer a private ordeal. She had stepped into open conflict, her accusations heard by dozens, and whether she triumphed or was destroyed would depend on her ability to keep pressing forward. The solitude she once cherished was gone, replaced by a fragile coalition of suspicion, fear, and the faint possibility of allies. But more than anything, she sensed the HOA had underestimated her resolve, and that miscalculation might prove their undoing. The weeks that followed the tense meeting became a test of endurance that Savannah had never imagined she would face when she first bought her modest house on the quiet street. The board had not admitted to anything, but the mere act of her presenting evidence in front of neighbors seemed to ignite a silent war, and the HOA responded with a barrage of tactics designed to erode her stamina and paint her as a destabilizing presence. Letters arrived almost daily now, each one citing a new violation. Her garden shed was deemed aesthetically non-compliant. Her compost was ruled a sanitation hazard. The rain barrel behind her house was suddenly considered an unauthorized water collection device. Every letter carried the same tone of cold authority, as if the board were less a group of suburban volunteers and more a tribunal intent on dismantling her life piece by piece. Savannah knew better than to believe these actions were coincidental. They were strategic, an attempt to drown her in bureaucracy and strip away her credibility, so that by the time the truth about the animals came to light, she would already be discredited in the eyes of her neighbors. Still, she refused to retreat. Michael, her attorney, encouraged her to document everything meticulously, and so she filled binders with each letter, each time-stamped photograph, each peculiar incident that suggested intrusion on her property. Yet, for all her diligence, she could not shake the feeling that something darker was at play. One night that sensation crystallized into reality. She was returning from the grocery store, the trunk of her car heavy with produce and soil amendments, when she noticed movement near her side gate. At first, she thought it was a neighbor walking a dog, but as her headlights swept across the fence, she caught sight of two figures dressed in dark clothing, crouched low as if attempting to bury something. She braked hard, heart thundering, and for an instant their faces turned toward her headlights, but before she could react, they vaulted over the fence and vanished into the woods beyond. Dropping her groceries on the porch, she rushed to the spot and found the soil freshly disturbed. Digging quickly with her hands, she unearthed another container, identical to the one that had held the ferret. This time it was empty, but clinging to its interior were tufts of coarse gray fur, unmistakably animal hair. Her breath caught as she realized that the intruders had just planted another creature, one that had already escaped or been released. The following evening, the proof arrived in dramatic fashion. Neighbors reported hearing loud, guttural calls near the drainage canal behind her yard, and when she investigated with a flashlight, she glimpsed the unmistakable outline of a young hyena, its hunched silhouette loping awkwardly through the tall grass. Panic rippled through the community. Residents who had once dismissed her as paranoid now flooded the forum with posts demanding action. Yet, rather than acknowledge the obvious implication that such an animal could only have been deliberately released, the HOA doubled down, accusing Savannah of maintaining a hidden menagerie. They filed an emergency complaint with the county, demanding that her property be condemned if immediate remediation was not enacted. It might have ended there, with her isolated and overwhelmed, had it not been for an unexpected breakthrough. One of her cameras, repositioned after the last intrusion, captured a clear image of the same van she had glimpsed before. This time, however, the lens caught more, a logo faintly visible on the side panel beneath a layer of mud. Enlarging the image, Savannah froze as she recognized the emblem. It matched the stylized oak tree that adorned every HOA newsletter and banner. She felt a grim satisfaction bloom within her chest. They had grown careless, and their arrogance had betrayed them. She brought the footage to Michael, who immediately contacted the county authorities. Yet even with this, progress was slow, for the HOA wielded influence and connections, and each official seemed reluctant to challenge them directly. Meanwhile, the harassment continued. Her mailbox was pried open and rifled through, her garden fence spray-painted with the words, "Animal Hoarder," and twice she found small piles of raw meat tossed into her yard, laced with what appeared to be powdered chemicals. She disposed of them carefully, wearing gloves, her anger sharpening with every attempt to break her spirit. The breaking point came during a community safety inspection, staged by the HOA under the guise of protecting residents. A group of board members arrived unannounced with clipboards and cameras, demanding entry into her home to check for evidence of illegal animal housing. When she refused, citing her rights, they stood on the sidewalk calling loudly for neighbors to witness her obstruction, their voices rising with sanctimonious indignation. Children were ushered inside, curtains twitched open and shut, and Savannah realized they were attempting to turn the entire community against her in a single performance. She filmed them from her porch, her hands steady despite the fury boiling inside her, and when she later reviewed the footage she noticed one detail they had overlooked: a small crate left in the bed of their truck, its bars visible through the open. Tarp containing what looked like another sedated animal. That image became her weapon. Michael filed a formal injunction against further inspections and submitted the video as evidence of misconduct. The county, pressured by the escalating absurdity of the situation, finally agreed to open an investigation. For the first time, Savannah felt momentum shift slightly in her favor, though she knew the battle was far from won. The HOA had not yet shown desperation, and desperate adversaries were the most dangerous of all. Late that night, as she walked her darkened garden and listened to the rustle of leaves, Savannah understood with piercing clarity that she was no longer simply defending her property. She was uncovering a machine built on intimidation and deceit, one that thrived by isolating individuals and breaking their resistance. And though she was weary and often afraid, she also felt something else awakening within her, a resolve forged not from anger alone, but from the recognition that if she yielded, the truth would vanish beneath the weight of lies, and the next victim would simply take her place. The court hearing was scheduled on a gray Monday morning, the kind of day when the sky itself seemed undecided between rain and fog, and Savannah sat in the hallway of the county courthouse with her binder of documents pressed tightly against her chest as though its weight could keep her heart steady. Around her, attorneys and plaintiffs shuffled in and out of courtrooms, their voices a low murmur against the echo of shoes on polished tile, but she felt herself enclosed in a bubble of focus, aware only of the stakes that had grown beyond her. Comprehension. What had begun as a single strange sighting had evolved into a war of attrition against a board determined to break her. And now everything would be decided not in her garden, not on the forum, but in a room where words and evidence would either save her or condemn her. When the case was called, she walked into the courtroom to find the HOA already assembled on the opposite side. Their attorney, a sharp-suited man whose expression carried the smug assurance of someone accustomed to winning by intimidation. Joan Barnett sat at the front, her smile intact but her eyes flicking to Savannah with a mixture of disdain and wariness. The proceedings began with the HOA's accusations, delivered with the calculated calm of practiced rhetoric. Savannah had allegedly fostered conditions that attracted dangerous wildlife. She had supposedly constructed unauthorized habitats. She had created a public safety hazard that required extraordinary measures. Photographs were passed to the judge, blurred images of animals near her fence, screenshots of forum posts, even the twisted interpretation of her carrying the sedated ferret into her home, portrayed now as concealment of evidence. Each piece was presented as undeniable proof, and when the attorney concluded, murmurs of agreement spread faintly among the spectators. Then it was Savannah's turn. Her lawyer, Michael, rose, his voice deliberate, neither rushed nor theatrical, and began to peel back the facade layer by layer. He presented the video footage of the van releasing the antelope, the image of the crate visible in the HOA's own truck during their so-called inspection, the tag stamped HOA property recovered from her soil, and finally the expert testimony of Dr. Elaine Mercer, who explained in firm, scientific language that the animals bore clear signs of captivity and deliberate release. As each piece was laid before the court, the atmosphere shifted, the smug confidence of the HOA attorney faltering as inconsistencies emerged. Michael pressed further, highlighting the absurdity of blaming a single homeowner for a pattern of exotic animals whose appearance could not possibly occur without intervention. The turning point came when Elaine was asked directly whether these animals could have arrived naturally. She leaned forward, her voice clear and unwavering, and said, "No. Their presence here is artificial, orchestrated, and dangerous. Whoever is responsible has both access to specialized equipment and the willingness to endanger an entire community. The evidence points not to negligence by Ms. Rose, but to deliberate release, and given the markings on recovered items, the connection to the HOA is undeniable." A hush fell over the room, broken only by the shuffling of papers as Joan shifted uncomfortably in her seat. In that silence, Savannah felt something she had not felt in months, the tide turning. The judge's questions grew sharper, directed not at her but at the HOA, asking why their vehicles had been in restricted areas, why equipment marked as theirs had been discovered buried on private property, why photographs conveniently framed her as a culprit without ever showing the true origin of the animals. Joan attempted to answer with her usual poise, but under scrutiny her words grew brittle, her smile strained, and at last the judge raised a hand, cutting through the tension with final authority. The decision was delivered with measured gravity. The HOA's claims against Savannah were dismissed as unfounded, their actions deemed negligent at best and malicious at worst. The court ordered a full investigation into the board's conduct, including their ties to outside organizations and their use of equipment for unauthorized purposes. As the words echoed through the courtroom, Savannah exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding, the weight pressing on her chest, lifting at last. Joan's composure cracked visibly, her lips tightening into a thin line, and the attorney beside her scribbled notes with a speed that betrayed panic. When Savannah left the courthouse, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing streaks of pale blue sky breaking through the clouds, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she felt the faint outline of freedom. She had not simply defended her name. She had exposed the truth, tearing a hole in the armor of an institution that thrived on fear and control. The war was not over. She knew investigations and reprisals would follow, but the balance had shifted irrevocably. The HOA was no longer the accuser standing above her. They were the accused, scrambling beneath the weight of their own corruption, and she was no longer the silent outsider but the witness who had refused to be broken. In the weeks after the hearing, the neighborhood seemed almost unrecognizable, not because the houses had changed or the trees lining the cul-de-sac had grown, but because the air of certainty that once belonged to the HOA had evaporated. Where once Joan Barnett's voice carried unquestioned authority, now there were whispers about her absence at meetings, about the sudden resignation of 2 board members, about county investigators arriving quietly with boxes and folders and leaving with sealed evidence bags. The manicured lawns looked the same, yet neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Savannah now nodded awkwardly when passing, their expressions a mixture of relief and shame, as though they had been complicit in a story they no longer wished to tell. Savannah accepted the gestures with polite detachment, not out of bitterness but because she understood that what had been broken between them could not be restored by a simple nod. Her house became once again a place of work and solitude, though solitude of a different kind. She tended her garden with the same patience as before, but now every seed she planted felt like a small act of reclamation, a reminder that her home belonged to her and no one else. The cameras remained, not out of fear but as quiet sentinels, and the binders of documents stayed on the shelf as testimony to what she had endured. The animals no longer appeared in her yard. The serval, the macaw, the hyena, all vanished as though they had been figments of a fever dream, and the silence they left behind was almost unsettling. Yet, in that silence, she found clarity. The HOA had tried to weaponize fear, bureaucracy, and spectacle against her, but in the end they had revealed themselves, and the law had seen them for what they were. On a late afternoon, she sat by the small pond at the back of her property, watching a fox cross through the brush with its natural, unmanipulated grace, and she felt something loosen in her chest. The neighborhood might never be a community in the truest sense, but it no longer held power over her spirit. She had endured, not by shouting the loudest or by forcing herself into belonging, but by refusing to surrender to lies. That knowledge was enough. The house that once felt like a fragile refuge had become something stronger, a testament to survival and to the quiet strength of someone who refused to be erased.